Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Patient Engagement Open Forum and to this special session titled Demystifying the Methodology to Determine Market Value when Remunerating the Patient Community for Interactions with the Pharmaceutical Industry. So my name is Nicole Wicke. I am a program manager at the Synergist, and I'm so pleased to have you all with us here today. Next slide. So as you'll recall, the Patient Engagement Open Forum is a series of events where we co-create, work together, collaborate, really towards driving stronger patient engagement. So the forum aims to provide a holistic perspective of patient engagement, accelerating collaboration and co-creation, breaking down fragmentation that can tend to happen in patient engagement work. So welcome once again. Next slide, please. So before we formally begin, just a few housekeeping items for today. So in today's session, towards the end, we're going to have a panel discussion and a Q&A. So for this panel discussion, please provide your questions to the panel using the Q&A function. We'll keep an eye on the Zoom chat as well, but we'll refer to the Q&A primarily. And we'll make every effort today to respond to your questions. But we're really going to focus on the big questions for today, moving our discussion forward. Inevitably, we might not be able to address everything that's coming through, and we'll make our best effort to follow up on any unanswered questions. And also to note that this session is being recorded, and it will be available after the session for you to share within your networks and with your colleagues and to consult at a later date. Next slide, please. Just to pause and take a note about compliance with competition law. So of course, we're discussing a topic today that's got heightened sensitivity. So please be mindful of competition law and make every effort to not share sensitive or strategic information that would violate any legal provisions. Next slide, please. Briefly, here's our agenda for today. I'm going to set the scene for a few minutes, followed by some introductions with our panelists and speakers for today. And we'll drive right into demystifying fair market value, or FMV, followed by a panel discussion and Q&A. So this is our second patient engagement open forum session on the topic of remuneration. So this is remuneration for the patient community for interactions with the pharmaceutical industry. This is a frequently discussed topic, and it can be highly complex and at times even a little bit controversial. And you'll recall from our last session that there's collaborative work underway at PFMD in a project called Patient Engagement, Remuneration, and Fair Market Value. So in this work, we're drawing from really exceptional work on this topic, looking to harmonize global standards for fair remuneration. So this work has been driven by a steering committee and bolstered by extensive public consultation and engagement with key stakeholders. So you'll recall that late last year, we had a public consultation with the patient engagement community at large around the global remuneration principles, which have been now consolidated, and I'm pleased to share that they're available as of today on the PFMD website. So thanks to everyone who took the time to individually or organizationally provide your input there. It was an overwhelming response. Thank you so much. So our work harmonizing the global principles found alignment and consensus across the board around fundamental principles that the patient community has a right to be remunerated and that the level of remuneration should be fair and appropriate. So this aspect of fairness should take into account individual expertise, the activity, the complexity of the task assigned, and the country of residence. So yet we still have some work to do to see progress on international remuneration standards around those three aspects. So the work within this project is now focusing on co-creating a framework and methodology that takes these factors into account fully. And this work is in development with the steering committee, and we'll be engaging with you all along the way this year for you to help us in shaping it. So at the base of any remuneration methodology is fair market value. And today we'll develop a deeper understanding of this topic, shed light on what FMV is, what is it based on, How can we improve FMV and its application in a more equitable remuneration framework and methodology? Next slide, please. So let's think about the drivers of change here. There's three key stakeholders that are essential drivers of change with respect to fair remuneration, and all will be represented on our panel today. So there's no denying that all three of these stakeholders that you see here need and can benefit from the co-creation of mutually agreed standards to drive fairness and transparency. So patients want and deserve to be paid fairly and to feel appropriately valued and respected for their contributions. The pharmaceutical industry needs to mitigate risk and align its internal approaches to externally recognized standards and realities. Data providers rely on quality data for their market analysis. So fair and transparent remuneration standards cannot be created in isolation, and none of us can tackle this alone, nor should we. So therefore, we're seeking to understand the context and co-create a solution together, striving for implementation and for continuous improvement. So a commonly agreed sense of transparency and equity will ameliorate the sensitive tension around patient engagement, enabling fair and compliant interactions, mitigating public scrutiny, and also reducing scrutiny that we can tend to have of each other. So without further ado, I would like to hand things over to Laura McKeowney, who's going to introduce our panel for today. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And thank you, Nicole and Sylvia, for their great leadership of this project overall on behalf of PFMD on what Nicole has already said is a very critical and complex topic. And hello, everyone from all over the world. I see the chat has gone live with all of your locations. I'm calling in from Basel, Switzerland. I know many of you have visited this part of the world because of the pharmaceutical companies. But I also want to stress that we really want to use the Q&A facility rather than the chat box for your questions, because we have a great team behind us helping to facilitate those Q&As so that we can gather them together, make sure we get through as many of them as possible. So without further ado, let me start the process of the introductions of our panelists. And critical to PFMD is the concept of co-creation, and that co-creation has to be with all of the impacted stakeholders. So this session, once again, is bringing together stakeholders across the patient engagement sphere so that we can talk together and really, as Nicole said, get to understand this very complex subject in a more deeper way. So we have a representation from the industry with Martin Eschbach, from the patient community with Dr. Stanimir Hasadziev. Stan, I really hope I pronounced that right. And a data provider, which is perhaps a little element that many of you have not come into contact with, but a data provider with Erik on the fair market values that are represented towards the industry. So let me first pass over to Stan and invite him to introduce himself.
Hello,
Stan.
everyone. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm Stan. I'm Bulgarian, so I live in one of the smaller and poorer countries in Europe. Facing quite lots of challenges, but last almost 20 years I've dedicated to the patients community. I'm a medical doctor by training, but currently I'm leading the biggest patients umbrella in my country. I've been also on the board of the European Patients Forum, and I'm the Secretary General of the Patient Access Partnership, Pan-European multi-stakeholder cooperation based in Brussels and focusing on access.
Thank you so much, Stan. And now I'm going to hand over to Martin. Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for having me, and hello, everyone. So different to Stan, I'm not a long experienced patient engagement veteran. although I'm with Novartis since 20 years, I'm a lawyer by training at Novartis for a long time with legal services. 1 year ago, I joined the patient engagement team, which was headed previously by Laura. And my first project was fair market value rollout. So I learned a lot in implementing, rolling out the fair market value. It's not rocket science, but it's still not easy at all as well. So I'm happy to be with you and to share my experience in that regard.
Thank you very much. And yesterday, everyone, I was teasing the panel a little bit that I was going to ask them. My first question would be, what made you smile today? So Martin, you said that you promised to have a very creative answer. So I'm going to let the other gentlemen off the hook, but I am going to put you on the spot a little bit. So what made you smile today before we get to Erik?
To see you again, Laura, in good mood. This is my best creativity I can do. No, what made me smile today? Today is sunny out here in Germany. It's been a good day. So, and I'm happy to be with you on this panel. It's going to be a great session. One disclaimer: we work together with Erik's team with Cutting Edge, and he's an awesome partner, and he knows his stuff for sure. So I'm looking forward to that session.
Many thanks, Martin, and touche, as we say. Erik, let's come to you. I'm super excited about this. Your partnership has been invaluable during the course of this project, and your willingness to participate in a very transparent way and share the methodology and your knowledge today is so much appreciated. So over to you.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you to everybody. I'm really happy to be here today. I am the Chief Operating Officer here at Cutting Edge Information, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into my slides and my presentation. But we have been focused on fair market value really since it started to emerge as a topic within the industry. So we have been looking into fair market value data for more than 10 years now, and over the last 5 or 6 years, we've really been focused on it as our sole area of inquiry. And I've been along for the ride. In a previous life, I did do some research on patient engagement and the development of patient-centric organizations within the pharmaceutical industry. So it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and it's exciting to me to be able to bring these two worlds together in this session today. Laura, do you want me to jump right in, or did you have anything else you wanted to?
Yes, no, Erik, I think we can jump right in. And just for the audience, when we're not talking, we'll turn our cameras off and then we'll all come back in together after Erik's presentation. What I would ask you to do, just a reminder again, as Erik is going through the presentation, he might be introducing you to some topics or processes that perhaps you haven't been familiar with. Please just capture the question, get it onto the system, and we will do our very best. We're going to let Erik run through his presentation and not take any questions during that presentation, because in the build-up, some of your questions may actually get answered. So over to you, Erik. Best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. All right, I'm sharing my screen here, the first technical hurdle of the day. All right, can everybody see that? Looks like it. Okay. All right, demystifying fair market value. Again, I'm Erik Bolish. I do hope everyone's having a good day. I hope everybody is safe and healthy, most importantly in these times. What am I going to cover today? All right. I want to start out by touching on who we are, so you can understand why I've been invited and why I'm talking with all of you. And then we'll get into discussing the role of FMV in our shared healthcare space. And because this is about demystifying fair market value, I'll dive into our area of specialization, which is data analytics. So this is probably a little bit of a different angle on patient remuneration than many of you may have seen before. But I'll show you how FMV remuneration rates are developed. And we develop them for a big chunk of the industry. So in essence, one way to set your thinking as we engage on this discussion is to remember that this is where a lot of the remuneration data comes from. This is where the numbers come from, and all of those rates that you may or may not have been exposed to actually come from. And then in our last two sections here, we'll talk about some of the real world issues that we see out there in terms of how rates are set. So there are some best practices. There are certainly some challenges that everyone faces, especially when it comes to patients and other participant types. And we will close in our last major area, which is tiering. And tiering is a unique challenge for the patient community. So we'll drill down there before closing. All right, a little bit about us. Why am I talking about patient remuneration? Who is Cutting Edge Information? Some of you know who we are. We've been around since 2002. We are located on the East Coast of the United States, so it's morning for me over here. And for the last several years, we have been focused on issues of fair market value compensation in the life sciences. So that means pharma, biotech, medical devices, and so on. So I've been invited here today thanks to that perspective, thanks to our unique focus on FMV. You can see a lot of bona fides here on the screen, and we're very proud of all of them. But really what all of this amounts to is the fact that we at Cutting Edge, we're the industry's primary FMV observers and analysts. And that means that we are collecting and analyzing huge amounts of data to establish exactly what fair market value is. So as you'll see, when we talk about the data, we basically hold up a mirror to the industry and we say, here's what companies are paying, here's what they're paying cardiologists in Slovenia, or pharmacists in the UK, or in our case today, patients in any given market around the world. So we are tracking and publishing all of that information. And like I said, we're proud of our accomplishments, all of these points that you see up here on the screen, but we are also committed to constantly learning and constantly evolving. We have to be in order to keep our data as accurate and relevant as possible. One of the reasons that we've been so interested in discussing this work with PFMD and in speaking to this forum today, it stems from a real hope that your insights can help us to improve. Because like Nicole said earlier, this work doesn't happen in isolation. And our work on the data side of things in particular depends on stakeholders like all of you. So to that end, we have a poll, and I think Sylvia is going to bring this up. So this is just a quick question that we wanted to ask all of you. And the question is, which role or group best describes you, specifically in relation to patient remuneration? So where are you coming from? And there may be some overlap in some of these. You can just pick the one that best reflects who you are and where you're coming from. And it's a mix of industry and patients, but we want to get a sense of where the audience is today. And there are a lot of different perspectives on this topic. And because I'll be pulling back the curtain on FMVs to see how how this work is done, we want to show everybody else where you're coming from. See some responses coming in. We'll see if there's a response there. And Sylvia, you can share these back when you're ready.
Okay, I will share soon. I see a few votes are still coming in.
Okay.
I will share it in a few seconds.
Terrific. Oh, there we go. Interesting. Okay. So it is quite a mix. We have some clear industry presence as well. Of course, as we saw in the chat earlier, a lot of people logging in from the patient community. So one thing I would emphasize with this, and especially with this blend across this topic, is to bear in mind that we have some very different viewpoints and certainly some different experiences in terms of our exposure to patient remuneration and our own unique experiences with it. So as I'm talking about things today, some of these topics may be familiar to you, others may not. But bear in mind that there may be others in the audience who have very little or a lot of experience with any given topic. All right, I'm going to close this poll and we'll jump ahead to our next slide. Okay. I'm not going to spend too much time on why FMV exists. I know it's been covered in previous meetings. We have Martin on board, who is an expert in this area, and he can answer our questions around FMV regulations. But suffice to say, FMV is a requirement that we all navigate, whatever position we're coming from. Fair market value remuneration has been a reality for healthcare providers and professionals, what we call HCPs, for years now. And it is already fairly widespread on the patient side as well. So numerous bodies, as we know, have called for fair remuneration of patients. There's this drive out there to establish fair and appropriate remuneration rates that reflect the value of patients when they engage with the industry. And I can tell you that companies are setting these rates for patients internally. So they exist, and the industry is taking it very, very seriously. So we regularly field questions about patient remuneration from all of our clients. And the frequency of those questions has increased over the last 12, 18, 24 months. So it's very much a topic that is top of mind for everybody. So what is fair remuneration? It's this concept that in engagements with the industry, outside experts are fairly compensated for their time and for the value they bring. So value is a key word here. Transfers of value are at the heart of FMV. Outside experts provide value to a company, and the company remunerates them in exchange. So in other words, experts are paid for their work. In this case, patients are involved with companies, they're involved in medical development, they're involved in market research and so on, because their contributions carry value, and fair remuneration naturally follows. Now for the industry, FMV incorporates a balance of compliance concerns and engagement concerns. So you have these two poles. There is a framework for approaching these two poles that's already in place with HCPs, so with medical providers and professionals. Within the industry, ethics and compliance teams are seeking to mitigate risk. They want to mitigate risk in their remuneration practices, of course. At the same time, they have a stake in allowing their colleagues to successfully engage with outside experts. So companies are concerned about ensuring that their payments are defensible and appropriate, but also competitive in attracting the services of experts. So that's where we are with HCP FMV. Patient FMV is less evolved. And this is a core part of my message today. In terms of understanding FMV, we look to the HCP model to guide us. We know there are differences. Patients are not the same as doctors, and even within the range of healthcare professionals, there are a lot of differences. You have highly specialized physicians, you have nurse practitioners, physician assistants, you have technicians, you even have former regulators and payers. So there are a lot of people under this umbrella, but the framework exists. What I'm showing you today, this is how companies approach fair market value. This is how they approach remuneration. And that is what we'll get into now. So let's take a look at data analytics. All right, we've addressed the fact that establishing appropriate and consistent payments is critical for the industry. We've talked about how we have a reliable physician model for doing this, but where does the data come from? How does the industry get it? So this is where our methodology comes into play. And as I talk about the data, I'm hoping that you will gain some insight into how cutting edge information identifies patient rates in the first place, how we communicate those rates back to the industry as a second part, And then thirdly, taking a step back, how we collectively can drive positive change in this space. All right, so let's start with where FMV rate data actually comes from. Right now, when companies are setting or evaluating their remuneration rates, they'll usually bring in an independent third party like us to provide FMV data, or at least conduct an analysis. So these third parties, along with the industry, along with the companies, tend to use one of three approaches for developing data. So let's jump down to the bottom of the slide here and start with number 3. FMV based on physician salary was a traditional way of calculating rates. So for a long time, salary was one of the only objective data points that anyone had to work with. So in essence, what you would do is boil down salary to hourly compensation. And voila, there's your FMV rate. Salary, though, it turns out, is limiting for two main reasons. One, it's not readily available in a lot of markets. Some of the Western markets, especially in developed markets, you can get access to this information, but it's a little bit piecemeal. And then when you go into other markets, it can be really hard to track down. Secondly, the second problem, it actually does a relatively poor job of reflecting the value of external experts. So you could think of it like this, a doctor's day job doesn't necessarily carry the same value as the work they're doing on behalf of the industry. And then when you think about patients, so for our purposes today, salary is especially problematic for patients and family caregivers and so on, because it is essentially irrelevant in that it has very little or no bearing on the value that they're bringing to engagements with the industry. So salary is problematic. Let's move up to the second option. So a common option in the industry is to bring in a consultant to do assessments. So an individual or a team will come into a business unit, maybe a region or a particular country, and they'll assess the historical data of payments. They'll look at the numbers and they'll use their industry knowledge to provide feedback on appropriate compensation levels. It works well. It tends to be somewhat narrowly focused in that it's not necessarily a global approach, so you lose out on consistency. And that brings us to option number 1 here, which is what Cutting Edge provides to clients. We call them market-based rates. What we're doing is we're actually using hourly rates set by companies, set by the industry. And this is very important. It sounds pretty simple, but our stance is that these rates, this data, is naturally the most accurate information any of us can possibly get about FMV rates and what's being paid on an hourly basis to external experts. So where do we get that data and what do we do with it? Now, we run an annual data collection initiative, which involves surveys and perhaps more importantly, the collection of actual rate cards from the industry. So a rate card is an internally published document that shows hourly remuneration levels for any number of different specialists, different medical professionals, non-medical professionals around the world. So going country by country by country. We collect this information from the industry. In our recent data collection initiatives, the mix of sources tends to run about 75 or 80% pharma and biotech, and about 20 or 25% medical technology, so your device and diagnostic companies. So there's a blend of different kinds of life science industry companies represented in the information. So at this point, we've collected hundreds of thousands of data points, and every year we put that data through a model that incorporates a host of other economic indicators and market factors to produce hourly FMV rates. What you see on screen here is how we get to the actual remuneration data that we publish and provide back to the industry. So all of this information, all the data moves through a regression analysis. So for our most recent rate database, the 2022 rate database, we plugged in about 146,000 different individual hourly rates collected from the industry. Those data points run through the regression alongside the economic indicators, and what we come out with are hourly rates for about 260 different individual specialties and roles. So that includes physicians, of course, but also patients, caregivers, and advocacy group personnel. We provide those rates for about 130 different markets, so it's global. It's the same approach globally. Though the data comes from each individual market, we provide the rates around the world. And then furthermore, we break each role type down into 4 tiers. Tiering is very important, and we'll get into that later. But so for patients or caregivers, we are providing data across 4 different tiers. So when we visualize what this means, what happens when this data comes out of our regression? You get a curve. So if any of you have taken statistics and you can cast your mind back, this curve shows us the output of our process. The data comes in, data comes out. What this curve is it represents the range of rates paid in the market. So let's say this is the curve of payments, hourly payments made to a patient. Right in the middle, of course, you have the median. So in our example here, half of companies pay less than 77 euro per hour, and the other half pay more. But we collect rates that fall at more than just the median, right? So you have a top and a bottom. So at the bottom, at the 25th percentile, 1/4 of companies in this example would be paying less than 64 euro, and 3/4 of companies would be paying more. And likewise, at the top end, paying 90 euro per hour would put your remuneration higher than 75% of the industry. But the main point here is that right in the middle, you have your fair market value window. This range here is the range of appropriate and defensible rates that can be paid to the specialist. We're calling it a patient, so a patient in this example. At the higher end, we think about that, the poles of compliance and competitiveness. At the higher end, your rates will naturally be more competitive. This isn't what the data actually look like when we provide it to our clients. I'm going to show you an example of that. Here's what we end up with. So at the top of this slide, you see details about the particular type of role that we're highlighting rates for. In this case, we're looking at a family caregiver in Switzerland. This is a set of tier 3 rates. So tier 3 is at the bottom of our tier structure. This might roughly equate to individuals who are operating at the local level. Along the left-hand side of this slide, you see percentiles. So it's not just the median and the 25th and 75th percentile, like I showed you in the last slide. We show rates at quite a few more percentiles. And then most importantly, and we're going to talk about this more in just a moment, we identify the base hourly rate. So that's the second column here. The base hourly rate is the core hourly payment for, in this case, a Swiss caregiver. So at the median, what do we have? It's 65 Swiss francs per hour. And this base hourly rate, at whatever percentile you may want to pinpoint, is very important in the setting of fair market value rates. Now, we do publish a great deal of other data. I'll call these up here on the screen. You don't have to worry about all this information. These are rates for a number of different types of activities that a caregiver might engage in. But the point is, we're collecting and producing a lot of data around hourly remuneration. So we've talked about here where the data comes from. You've seen what the FMV product looks like, a whole bunch of numbers. Next, we'll discuss what happens when companies set their FMV rates based on this information. So if a company uses us for rates, as we've all just seen, they have a dizzying amount of data to draw upon. And remember, that's for every type of specialist, every external expert and non-provider participant type in every market required. At the beginning of the rate setting process, maybe a company is embarking upon this for the first time, or maybe they're reviewing and refreshing how they approach remuneration, which happens once every 2 or 3 years or so. They are going to engage in the steps here that we see on the screen. So let's split this slide into 2 parts, and we'll look at the top part first. There are 2 major components to preparation up at the top of the slide. The first is setting those base rates. So companies establish a baseline hourly compensation rate or remuneration rate for every type of external expert in a market. And they do this at each tier. In terms of setting the rate itself, this hourly rate, maybe they use the median. That's very common. Maybe they pick a specific percentile, so they're paying at the 65th percentile or the 45th percentile, but they pick an hourly number in there. And this base hourly rate, this is the building block of FMV. This is the hourly value assigned to any external partner. Now, moving down to the second item here at the top of the slide, they also establish tiering criteria. So tiering is critical to FMV remuneration. And we'll talk more about how it works in the next section. But in essence, among physicians and other HCPs, you're tiered higher if you have more expertise. So if you're bringing more value to the engagement. Now, the bottom of this slide, the second section, it builds off the first. So this is what happens when a company engages a new external expert. They need to write a new contract and settle in with this individual. So one thing they do, they tier that individual to gauge their expertise and their value. That allows them to then identify remuneration for the activity under discussion. Maybe the activity is a speech or a series of speeches, or work on an advisory board, or maybe on a market research panel. But whatever it is, the company is using that base hourly rate as the building block for remuneration for that activity. There are a lot of nuances that enter this equation. So when companies are setting base hourly rates for any type of expert, they think about a number of other factors. They're in yellow on the upper left-hand part of the slide. They may set a single rate, let's say for patients, or they may set a range of acceptable rates. And there's no right or wrong here. So a patient could be paid, could be remunerated at a rate of 50 euro per hour, or it could be a range of 40 to 60 euro with some flexibility there for the team as they're choosing how to compensate for this particular activity. Moving to the second portion in dark blue, the companies will frequently look at how previous payments have been received in the market, and they'll use that to determine how much they may want to adjust their rates up or down. So they're very sensitive to disruption here. As Martin alluded to a few moments ago, it's not rocket science, but it's a very time and labor intensive process to set these rates in every market around the world. And then finally, speaking of around the world, there at the bottom, if a group or a team is coming from a global perspective, it's important that they involve local operating units in these discussions. So as a company is setting hourly rates, they want to talk to the teams on the ground in the country. And that's especially true if they're operating in markets where there may be rate restrictions or caps on payments. And those individuals within the country are going to be the local experts, and they're going to help to determine the best path forward. So there are a lot of moving parts to setting rates. It is extremely complicated, but just bear in mind that patients and other participant roles, those other types, these are all part of this system. So this is how companies are approaching the concept of remuneration. And things do actually get a little more complicated, as you can probably imagine. You know, the fee for a given activity is just part of the picture. Other remuneration comes into play too. So up here on the slide, you see travel, hospitality, which is meals and other considerations. and preparatory time. These are all very standard components of an engagement fee, and depending on country legal codes. But I'm putting them up here so we can recognize the fact that there are other components to the engagement and to the fee that is being paid. In each one of these topics, we have conducted separate full webinars on these topics, so everyone can feel free to take a look at those. But each one of them is a set of challenges onto themselves. All right. Now, I want to get to the specific challenge of setting rates for different patient and participant types. We've talked about where the data come from. It comes directly from the industry. We've talked about how rates get set. Companies use that data to identify hourly remuneration for patients and every other type of doctor, nurse, specialist, technician, and so on. But we at Cutting Edge, we can only reflect what we observe in the industry. The data is essentially transparent, and that's part of the beauty of analytics. But that also means that until the industry changes how it's approaching patient FMV, we can't provide different data. So that means that in any area that's evolving, like patient remuneration is, we need to see that change happen before we can report on it. It's a chicken and egg situation. So I hope that most of you are familiar with this phrase. A lot of companies use our rates. They may want to change how they remunerate patients, but they can't do it until they see a change in the data. So it just circles round and around and around. So in our metaphor, we have this chicken and egg situation. If we think of the egg as the status quo, this is how rates are set now, this is the data. We're looking at a relatively underdeveloped approach to patient remuneration. And this is relative to that HCP framework that we've talked about. So participant roles, expertise, tiering, they're not clearly defined, or they're often not clearly defined. And that means that the rates themselves, these hourly rates, also can't clearly be differentiated. So when we get to the chicken, which is our data, the patient remuneration data, the rates are going to reflect that lack of detail and differentiation. So when we talk about driving positive change, if that in fact is an objective for many of us, this is what we're talking about: increasing differentiation, increasing the level of detail and specificity that we are able to observe in the rates. So what does this look like when we examine actual numbers? Here on the slide, you see at the bottom, the black arrow, this is your range of hourly rates. And then right in the middle of the slide, you have 3 different tiers. Let's say these are patient tiers, external experts. Tier 3 would be considered lower, and tier 1 would be considered the highest. Usually for these 3 different tiers, you would have 3 different payments set. So you would set an hourly rate, as we talked about, a base hourly rate that falls at 3 different intervals, 1 for each tier. But when you have a lack of differentiation in the data, what you end up with is a lot of overlap. So the status quo right now, it provides us, at least in many countries, with relatively low differentiation among patient rates. So this means that payments for one patient or participant type is going to look much the same as it does for another. So now imagine if patients aren't being differentiated at all in terms of expertise or in terms of the value that they're bringing to engagement. So this is very common. Untiered patients, this is something that we see in rate cards around the industry. In this case, a single hourly rate is provided for all external patient experts. And you can guess what happens here. Of course, there is 100% overlap in terms of the hourly rate being paid, regardless of expertise, regardless of the value that's being brought to the table. So this, of course, means that rates will be too high for some, they'll be too low for others. For the team working with this patient, there's little room to move. You can't go up and down because there's just one number that they have to work with. Think of rare disease categories where you have relatively few patients and they may be bringing a relatively high degree of value to the engagement. And it may make sense rationally to have a patient remuneration framework in place that allows you to reflect that value differently than for other patient types. But right now, under this approach, or the approach on the last slide, that doesn't really happen. What we're shooting for is greater differentiation. So more differentiation within the rates, a little separation in hourly rates being paid to different types of patients, or different types of participants, provides greater specificity and greater flexibility. What we see here on this slide, this mirrors the more fully evolved HCP model. In that model, that framework, it tends to differentiate fairly well among physicians at different levels of expertise and different levels of influence. This is how they think about this. So if flexibility is the goal, and you don't want rates to be overlapping quite as much as they tend to do now on the patient side of things, and you want patients to be paid what they're worth, you want companies on the industry side to be more satisfied with and confident in their own transfers of value, this is what we're aiming for here on the slide. This is what we want our chicken to grow up to be. You don't have a lot of overlap. Maybe the upper end of tier 3 overlaps with the lower end of tier 2 and so on, but you don't see a situation where everyone might be paid the same rate. That just doesn't make sense in the HCP world. Okay, this brings us to our final section. And I mentioned this topic repeatedly today. We have to address it head on. It is a bête noire of patient remuneration. And I know that Laura, Nicole, and the group have done some work around this topic. But what is tiering? Tiering is how the industry categorizes the relative expertise and influence of each external expert. It's part of risk mitigation. It's part of market competitiveness for these services. And it's also a core part of the FMV framework, just like the base hourly rate. There are usually 3 components to it. 1, identifying objective criteria. And these are criteria that are relevant to your desired expertise. And then applying that criteria and reviewing it on a regular basis to make sure that your external experts are tiered appropriately. So if we look at HCPs to see how this works, for medical specialists, it's relatively straightforward. It remains challenging, but it's relatively straightforward because even though tiering is inherently qualitative, the value of a particular type of expert is going to be unique to a company, there are quantitative criteria available on the HCP side. So here on screen, we see a bunch of different HCP tiering criteria. These are factors that companies use to establish objective, quantitative tiering frameworks. And here's an example of a common approach to tiering. Regardless of the criteria, the goal of an objective tiering process, of course, is that anyone performing the tiering exercise is going to reach the same assignment. So here on screen, you see some of these different criteria. In the first column are 4 different types of qualifications. And you'll note that these are all easily quantifiable, which makes it convenient for this particular talk. They're not always this easy. But along the top of the table are 4 different tiers. And then in each of those tier columns, we see a count or a range for each qualification that roughly corresponds to value and to expertise. So in practice, what this translates to is a tiering scorecard. And tiering scorecards have emerged as a standard tool for tiering on the HCP side. Here on screen, we see a simplified scorecard. These can get a little bit complicated. But what this does is It uses a couple of different criteria. We see two here, years of experience as well as clinical trial participation. But for each of these options, for each of the criteria, you have values awarded according to experience, and then points are tallied, and the HCP is assigned a total score. And then based on that score, as we see at the bottom of the slide, the HCP is assigned a tier. And remember, the tier directly influences hourly remuneration rates. This is part of that larger fair market value system. This is how the industry engages external experts. Now, just have a couple of more slides, because all of this has been focused on HCPs when we've talked about tiering, right? Medical providers for the most part. But what happens when we try to sort things out for the different patient participant types? It's a lot less clear. The difficulty that we face with these participant types is that roles alone do not necessarily communicate value. So when it comes to the patient community, there are different dimensions in play. There's the actual activity type, the engagement itself, and then there are levels of expertise, however those levels are measured for the patients who are involved. So in essence, the industry knows how to value let's say a globally recognized cardiovascular surgeon. And likewise, they know how to value a locally respected family doctor, but it's not so clear when it comes to the participant types here on the screen. And that brings me to my last slide. These are the definitions that we use for patient tiering, but because we base our definitions on the industry's positions, our own patient tiering definitions are extremely broad. We have very specific quantifiable measures in place for the HCP side, for the medical side. But for patients and the other participant types, the definitions are by nature very qualitative. We would love to make them more specific and more detailed. And again, that's one of the reasons that I'm so excited to be talking with you all today. But we can't tier and differentiate effectively. And this trickles all the way down to the rates, those hourly rates, if the industry doesn't. So when we hold up our analytical mirror, it's not going to be very precise. Basically, if there's not a lot of agreement out there on how to differentiate value for different participant types and different activities, it's hard for us to develop data that shows anything different. So I'll wrap things up here. To bring it all together, at present, and I hope I've made this clear, for patients and other participant types, the definitions and tiering remain relatively underdeveloped. And that means that the rates established for patients are naturally less differentiated than they might otherwise be. And this can lead to frustration, both on the part of the industry and on the part of the patient community itself. So we are at an early point in the evolution of patient FMV, and this group here today is well positioned to move things forward. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Laura. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the time and the attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thanks, Erik. And I have to tell you that both the chat and the Q&A have been going pretty fast and furious over this. Just again, I know there's a lot of content in the chat. We always, as in PFMD, we take the chat, we summarize all the key questions in the comments. That goes out as part of the PEOF. But just to help us facilitate this last session, because it is such a critical and controversial topic, please just load it onto the chat and we will get through it as fast as we can. Erik, I think I have to say that, to the audience, that part of the reason that you've come to this and you've acknowledged it there just at the end is that when you heard about the project, when you heard about the work that was done, you were very transparent with the aha moment that said, something needs to give here. The way that we're approaching it at the moment could definitely become a higher quality effort if we all partnered together with this project on the methodology towards determining FMV. So just for the audience and the participants, it's not normal that we have people like Erik coming into the PFMD scenario for PEOF, but this was really because there was that earnest understanding that we need to improve on this. So look, what an explosive topic, and many questions in the chat. But let me start maybe with Stan. Stan, since I have known you, you've been an advocate on many issues, but you have been a very eloquent and outspoken person on the subject of fair market value. Tell me, you're on our steering committee. What is your hope? And what is your hope for how we move forward with all of these discussions and this project?
First of all, I think it's a great responsibility now to talk on behalf of the patients community on this very, very controversial topic and very sensitive in a way. I follow very carefully what's in the chat, and could agree with most of the people, especially on the patients community side. Can understand also the hesitation, the frustration, and the confusion that many of us have when we talk about patients' remuneration. First, my expectation is really to out of this conversation, to have better understanding how these rates at the end are fixed and offered to patients. Very often, we know that they are simply not offered, they are fixed. Patients don't have the right to negotiate on that. Somebody has done it on their behalf. Somebody has valued them and invited them, and they simply have to sign some documents and be part of something. This is, I would say, maybe acceptable situation for the moment, but in the future, this shouldn't be the case. First, patients are experts. And as being experts, I would prefer, and I guess many of the people here in the chat and who are watching it, who are watching this broadcast would agree with me. If patients are invited to provide their expertise in what the companies are providing, they should be valued not as patients, but as experts, as any other expert within the team, or who are providing any feedback and bringing value back to the company. So it's not about being patient or not. It's about providing your knowledge, your experience to those who at the end might develop something, a product, or enter a market and benefit out of this. So I'm not going into details right now because probably we will have opportunity later on in the conversation, but being a patient doesn't make you an expert, and vice versa. Being an expert doesn't make you a patient and understanding better patients. So then the second layer of this conversation is what is really market. And I belong to markets in my country, which is small, poor, etc. It's considered to be the Bulgarian market. But then I'm also part of the so-called European market, because we have single market in Europe, as far as I remember, and at least everyone is claiming that. Still, when I provide my expertise, which is on different levels, locally, globally, etc., I'm very often valued as the patient expert or the patient representative from Bulgaria, and my remuneration is very often, it's unclear for me how it's it's done, because it could vary from company to company, from case to case. I never understood exactly what's all about. But being honest, the remuneration for patient representatives is not the leading motive for them to get involved into any activity of a company or anybody else. Patients have other motives, and they are not primarily the level of remuneration. Patients do expect to be part of the solution finding, for example, providing the expertise so that they can contribute to better design of products, better design of services to patients, etc. And this is what's the leading reason for patients to get involved. Remuneration comes, and it's important, but it's probably on second layer for patients. It doesn't make them to be, it shouldn't be the reason why patients should be kind of a second layer or second hand, as we call it in Bulgaria, second hand experts. They are, and they should be valued as first-hand experts, and their expertise should be properly evaluated and remunerated at the end. So how we do that is the big challenge. Hopefully out of this meeting, we will have better understanding on methodologies, etc. But the challenges are huge.
Thanks, Stan. And maybe not straight out of this meeting will we have the full understanding of the methodology that's being worked on. But just to stress to all the panelists, you probably, or to the audience and participants, I'm sure you've attended one of the first PEOFs where we had a presentation on the project. We're not going to get into details of the project on this, but rather really details of FMV. But Nicole will do a summary at the end, and we'd love you to follow this, because we want all the input as we design the project out. And Nicole has a very exciting piece of news to share with you at the end about one of the key deliverables that we're getting ready to launch. But let me move to Martin now. Now, Martin, in your introduction, you talked about the fact that you'd come into patient engagement. You're actually the legal and compliance person sitting in patient engagement for Novartis, and your first task was to implement a new approach to FMV. Now, did you know that when you accepted the job?
I wish I had.
And the second question is, reflecting upon the chat, what were some of the key learnings that you had in the past year as you did that? And maybe what are some of the watch outs that we shouldn't do?
Thank you, Laura. So, and thanks again also for the variety of arguments and opinions in the chat. So there's a lot to say, but I want to bring it back a little bit. When I joined the patient engagement team, and it was really something very new, I thought to myself, I knew it all over, because patient centricity we had right, left, and center at Novartis. But that's not true. We thought we had patient centricity, but it's not really true. Thinking about patient and including patient in real decision making are distinctly different things. So there's a FMV now, there's a technical piece to it, and Erik is absolutely specialist, and we can talk a little bit of implementation and rollout in the various countries, but you always need to bring it back. I mean, why are you doing this in the first place? And for us to put it very simply in one single line, it's for better decision making. We want better decision making, and better decision making you don't do with anecdotes, you do with data. And data you gather with true insights from patients, with a lot of patients or a lot of insights, and there you will get the evidence for also a better commercial profile. That's very clear. So, and this data-driven, this better decision-making is really important. And for better decision-making, you need clear objectives. Why are you doing and why are you asking for a service in the first place? And this is the number one question. And then if you want to have a true question and a serious question, then it should be also remunerated accordingly. That's just fair, because this is what we expect also besides FMV in the HCP world or in our private life. Huh? So we think if there's a true service which is brought to the organization, it needs to be remunerated accordingly. So if you have this set in the organization, then, but how do you do it? And I can tell you that it's easy to get bogged down with technicalities and intricacies. So, and we try to slice and dice this a little bit and then be also clear. And in the chat, there were a couple of things we say in given markets. I mean, we want to go out there with the rate, but the rate is across a given spectrum. So we don't differentiate, for example, within patients, we don't do this. So we say, as we've seen also, we have clearly as a patient or an expert and a thought leader, you can have a debate, of course, and how you do it, but it's clearly that we try to be implement this in an easy and palatable way, but still have the flexibility in the countries. And that's maybe a point which is also important. You need to make sure that what is mandated from the headquarters maybe, and where's the flexibility in the system, being in industry codes. There was some stuff in the chat, I think, from the Netherlands. Some countries are quite strict and put it down real low, and then you need to abide by those rules and regulations. That's clear, but these are things, challenges you need to take on. And so far the adoption is good, and so far also the experiences we've had is quite positive. But there's quite a lot of things you need to collaborate with the constituencies.
Thank you so much, Martin. Erik, I'm going to come to you, and I don't know if you've had a chance because you were presenting, but tiering has definitely got a reaction. Now, just to stress to everyone, the tiering is linked to activities and experiences, and it's not really about the participant type as such. Erik, would that be correct? And Trishna, we can always rely on Trishna to get it out there. She started the chat going by calling out everyone to be transparent as to who they were and other. And I think that set the tone for a really honest conversation on the chat. But, there's a lot of questions here, Erik, on tiering. Why does it matter? Do you think that this project on its completion is likely to shape tiering? And if so, do you think the industry will move with it? Because you're the data provider, the industry then has to adopt. So could you give us a little bit of insight to that?
The industry doesn't have to do anything, I've learned.
This is true too. This is true too. And I think many people on the chat might agree with that.
That is an excellent question. So I will start by trying to take not one step back, but a couple of steps back. And the term that I use about our position as observers of what's going on is agnostic. We're fundamentally agnostic to all of these topics in a way that I don't think anybody else here in the meeting is. A lot of you are mission driven on the industry side. There's concerns about risk mitigation and engagement and so on. But for us, if everyone decides across the industry that paying €10 per hour is the appropriate and best thing to do for patients across the EU or around the world, then that is what we are going to see, observe, and reflect in our data, and then communicate back to all of our clients. Obviously, that's unrealistic, and it's not the direction, frankly, that I'm hoping it goes, because when you have this lack of specificity, when you have this lack of differentiation, it just leads to questions and confusion. And this is, both Stan and Martin have spoken to this, but when you get into each individual country, I'm sure many of the attendees have experienced this as well. The questions are legion. The types of situations that you encounter, you will not have predicted when you're setting up your system in the first place. So tiering for patients, it need not reflect the tiering framework for HCPs. It's, as I alluded to, it's now has grown to the point with doctors, with HCPs, where it is relatively straightforward. People can at least agree that there's this scorecard approach. There are things we can measure, and everyone can agree on those things. It's viewed as being relatively objective. But those things don't exist for patients. I will also say they don't necessarily exist for other types of HCPs. So another area that we've looked at are nurse practitioners and physician assistants. In many cases, these are prescribers. These are experts in their area. A lot of times, these are individuals who are the main point of contact with patients in the clinical setting. But traditionally, they haven't had exposure to research opportunities. They aren't listed as authors in publications. And so you encounter a similar type of situation there. How do you tier these individuals? One thing we've seen, and this is relevant to the patient community, at least among some companies, there is an appetite for, there's interest in setting up different kinds of tiering approaches depending on the category of external expert that you're talking about. So there's a recognition that patient tiering, whatever that ultimately looks like, need not look like their HCP tiering framework. So they'll have a different set of processes, they'll have a different scorecard or whatever the approach is. And this opens the door to some of these concerns that I see came up in the chat during the presentation, where a different approach can be taken. So a tier could be based on expertise or activity or some other combination of factors. And this is the challenge. And then if we start to see that in the industry and reflected in the industry, we are going to go out and talk about what's industry standard, what's a best practice. And so companies all the time, they're asking us, how do we tier patients? How do we compensate or remunerate patients? What's the best approach here? We say, well, we're not going to tell you that there's one particular way to go, but here are the options. Here is something that's becoming industry standard. Here is a best practice that you may want to think seriously about implementing. And so coming out of this effort, if we see something productive and effective here, and companies are involved in the uptake, well, then it becomes very easy for us to say, here's how it is, or here's how it is in Europe, here's how it is in these markets, and so on. So we are eager for this to happen from that perspective, because more differentiation and more specificity just leads to improved data quality.
Thank you so much, Erik. Stan, let me come to you. And again, as a representative of the patient community, what do you see as the major opportunities and hurdles for the implementation of these standards? You're part of our steering committee. You've been very active in this. You work a lot directly with the industry. What do you think are the obstacles?
Well, I'll try to demonstrate this with an example from that happened to me. One of the things that I faced during this 20 years experience with the patients community. Not long ago, I was invited by one pharmaceutical company to speak at one of their global forums in the United States. And it was a big issue for the company, first of all, to understand whether I'm a patient representative, because I come from a patient organization, or I'm a medical doctor and healthcare professional because I have the medical training. It took about 2 months for this company really to understand what is the situation. At the same time, I was in the board of the National Health Insurance Fund representing patients. And then they started considering me to be a policymaker and decision maker, or someone who actually can make decisions that can influence the company's business. And that's a fact. I took decisions and my signature stays under 5 billion euros of the budget of my country. But this was the reason why patients want to get involved, in order to have a say and to be part of the decision. So after 2 months considerations internally, they decided that I'm patient representative. I'm not a governmental representative. I'm not a healthcare professional. I'm patient representative. But this time, it took so long time that at the end they had to buy me a flight ticket to the United States that cost several thousand euros. I'm not telling the price because it's a shame how much this flight ticket was. At the end, my contribution there was valued at a price of 5 coffees that I could buy in United States, just because my origin is Bulgarian. So it was not considered what I bring to the company there. What is the advice that I can give? What is the market value that they can gain out of my expertise and my involvement there? The only criteria for them to make my remuneration was where I come from, and they valued me exactly the same as I would provide advice to someone here locally for their local business or their local situation. So this makes the feeling that somebody spent on flight ticket as much as probably your salary in your own country for 10 years ahead for one night only, and values your expertise as little as 10 coffees. This is really what creates this hesitation, this frustration, and the feeling of not being fair of what you provide and how you provide it. Therefore, I do believe that we need to have more clear understanding how we do this evaluation, why, what is really the value that the company would receive. Is it a local value for some local campaigning or helping them to find more patients for let's say the clinical trials recruitment process, or it's something that the company could benefit years ahead and would help them to create new medicines, new treatment that potentially would be a source of income of billions for the company. And it's the same with the experts from the medical field. Therefore, I think we have to have this genuine, honest conversation and really to create this fairness in the entire system. It's important for everything that we do in the future. The risks here are, and we have to consider them, are really high. Like, are the patients really engaging with the industry only because of the remuneration?
Mm-hmm.
Are we commercializing somehow the advocacy work that we are all doing at the end? Or are the advocates going to be involved in this only for the remuneration and not for other reasons? But still, this fairness and the sense of market also should be cleared, and transparency, I think, is the key for this to be resolved in the future. So fairness, value, and transparency of what we do is important if we want to be effective, and the public to trust of the results of our work together.
Very comprehensive response, Stan, as usual. Thank you so much. I'm going to come to Martin next. Martin, I'll tell you the question so you have time to give it a little thought, but I do want to address a couple of things in the chat. I think there's a really kind of complicated situation evolving where we see many institutions, including the industry, they get so burdened by this process and in some cases frightened away by the subject of FMV that they go to third-party vendors, agencies to bring patients in, and they can do all the work for them. Can you give us your thoughts on that? And I'll give you a moment to think about that because I want to answer a couple of quick questions. There's been a couple of questions in the chat around clinical trial participants. This project does not cover clinical trial participants, but when we launch our global principles, you will see some reference to some great pieces of work that has already been done on that. So just to let you know that. We're also not covering academia at the moment, but I think Nicole has answered that that could be in scope if the collaboration effort at PFMD identifies that as a strategic priority. And then the last one is from, I'm not sure I understand the question, so I'm going to ask the person to be more specific. I think it was to Erik, and it was, is Erik presenting FMV before or after tax? So if you could just confirm, is that the question? Then after Martin, I'll come to Erik. And then I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up pretty quickly, but we will get back to many of these questions in written form. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Laura, and I can take Erik's question. There's no tax implications included because we have asked this multiple times. So it's regardless of any tax implications. So this is because every country does it differently. It's been a question in our rollout too, and some do it, they gross it up, some not. So that's going to be a individual question in the country. So before I move to the question, Laura, maybe one single thank you, Stan, for your experience with the company. So hopefully it was not us. I mean, the how can be very complicated, and we've seen it with your experience. But let's be just clear on. Let's not get bogged down by the how and then not do the why. So if we're all in agreement, this is the right thing, then let's be not overcomplicating, over-engineering the process. And maybe we miss out on a couple of nuances, but at least we have something out there which works and we can refine as we go and we move to the next level. So that's very important. And maybe to use then what we do when we partner with you, or we always, and that's what I said in my first comment, we always look to the services we want to get different to the HCP. When if you are a KOL, you always get KOL remuneration. If we want to get a patient insight, we don't need maybe the expert for this. And we will pay, this is our belief, we will pay patient remuneration. So this is why the question you have been encountered and you have been troubled with, maybe in our situation would be different. But that's just a side remark. Thanks for the comment. Laura, yes, absolutely true. It's a market out there, it's a business, 100%. And I'm not happy about that. Because I would like for us to ask to really think through what are our objectives, and then also to partner with the patient organization instead of, oh, this is complicated, let's try to cut some corners, maybe just for the sake of time, and then bring it all in. You don't know whether quality is the right quality you need. Again, it's about data, evidence, insights. You really need to get this sharp. Otherwise, you remain with anecdotes, and anecdotes just don't cut the deal. They will not drive you to better decision making. And if you really want to be on top of better decision making, it has to be, you have to do it. I'm sorry. So this is why we really, I mean, I know it's out there and we get a lot of requests whether we want to do it, and there's maybe the temptation to do it. And I urge, I mean, I advise against this.
And I think, Martin, in fairness, it also comes back to the subject of transparency. You know, we need to own it. We need to be proud that patients play a critical role in the decision-making processes within the company, and we need to be able to respond to that really dynamic environment. Regulators, payers who are all saying this must happen. You know, we need to have the patient experience data. We need to have your patient insights. So this is not some altruistic movement. It's real. I'm going to pass over to Nicole. Before I do so, John Linnell has put something in the chat, I think at least 2 or 3 times. So I want to make sure that he knows that we've got it now. And I also want to say that he is not being sarcastic, but I think this is a very deep reflection of how many people feel. There are a lot of emotions around this subject. And John has said, you know, look, when you think about the money that is spent to try and determine, you know, a fair market value in Switzerland for a caregiver at the median of $50. Okay, I might have got the figure wrong, Erik, but you know the point that I'm making. You know, when you stand back and think about that and the huge investment that could have been made, you know, being paid to patients, you know, so I don't think it's a question. I think it's just a real heartfelt and very indicative of how many patients feel when they are engaged in that process. So I just wanted to make sure that John felt his comment was read and now hopefully heard. Thank you so much. We knew that this would be an active debate. We haven't answered all the questions. I'm going to hand over to Nicole, but before I do so, I want to sincerely thank Erik, Martin, Stan. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you as panelists. And behind the scenes, we have Sylvia and Diana and lots more from the Synergist team and the PFMD community who have helped make today happen. So a really, really heartfelt thanks. And now we can put our cameras off, grab a coffee, take a little glass of water, and we're going to pass over to our very esteemed leader, Nicole.
Hey, no coffee breaks yet. We're almost done.
We can sip our coffee now.
Yes, now you can sip your coffee.
Sip it. It's cold.
Yes, and I think you were probably all in need of a tall glass of water after a really exceptional discussion. So thank you so much, Laura, for your great moderation. Stan, Martin, Erik, thank you very, very much for diving into this topic with us today. There's been a challenge for me to keep an eye on the chat and see our commentary coming through there and listen intently to the panel discussion. But really glad to see that everybody is really charged up around this topic, because we do have a lot of work to do to drive this forward. So I think also to the comments in the chat around resources and how we can channel our resources on this. I think one is that nobody can really go this alone. I said that in the beginning, and I'll say it again, that the data providers such as Erik and his cutting edge information team, the pharmaceutical industry and the patient community really need to come together around this. Mutually agreed standards are really what's going to reduce resources being wasted by anyone going and trying to achieve this element of fairness alone. So really need to come together around this. So Sylvia, if you could put the next slide, please. Thanks. So I just wanted to take a minute before we wrap up to let you guys know about upcoming work within this project. So as I mentioned earlier as well, we've got the global remuneration principles, which are available today. There's a lot of information in there. These are harmonized from really exceptional work that was done previously by the National Health Council in the US, by the FPA Patient Think Tank, and by IFPMA and others. So drawing heavily from IMI Paradigm and UPADI, and with public consultation and input from all of you. So thank you so much for your really extensive input there. And please go download them, use them. We will, as Laura said, do our best to address any unanswered questions from today in a follow-up article, a blog post on the session, tying in any things that we didn't manage to get to, recapping things that were coming through the chat, really trying to really fully report back on what we've discussed today. So keep an eye out for that. And then other two really interesting areas of work that we have coming is around developing global frameworks, so a standardized approach to how we look at different activities and interactions between pharma companies and patient community, and also expertise, which sort of lends into the whole discussion we had today around tiering. So and then eventually piecing those pieces, together into standards to determine remuneration at market value. So what does that look like procedurally? So building these pieces together, having really effective public consultation on these things will really develop those standards so that we can all work together to drive change and have more transparency, more equity in the way that we are approaching remuneration for these interactions. So stay tuned for upcoming public consultations on all of those elements. Also, following the session today, you'll receive a post-event survey. So please take a minute to respond. One, you can give us your feedback on the session today. And also, we've included a couple questions in there just to collect some additional information and insights from you guys that we can utilize to inform our current work on the project. So if you have any questions at all on today's session or this body of work, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is at the bottom of the screen. It's through the Patient Engagement Open Forum Communications. Reach out to the PEOF team. And we're really looking forward to continuing our dialogue on this work. So thank you once again. We look forward to bringing you all together again soon as we move this forward step by step. Have a wonderful evening or a great afternoon. Thanks again to our fantastic panel, Sylvia, the whole PFMD team, and everyone that provided their support and input for this session. So have a great afternoon, evening. Take care.